Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
Nowadays, we drive from place to place. We don't think about how difficult it was to get around back in the old days. And, nowadays we think nothing about, hopping your car and drive a couple hundred miles in a day. And all along you're crossing bridges and going through things and over things and tunnels and all kinds of stuff, which were not around a long time ago. And so some of those old things are still around if you look for them. They're becoming less common. And what's crazy is that up until recently, there's a ferry across the Potomac River that had been there for 230 years. 230 years. And now they're going to close because of a recent land dispute. And the weird thing about this is the last ferry. So at one point in time, there were a bunch of ferries to get you across the Potomac if you wanted to get across on foot, or you were on horseback, or you had a wagon. And in later years, if you had a car, you wanted to get across the Potomac, you could go find a bridge someplace or take the ferry. Well, this is from mymcmedia.org. Suzanne Pollock wrote it, but also is written up in The Hill by Joseph Choi. Raffi sent it to me. White's Ferry is ending its 230-year run over a land dispute. They've been taking commuters across the Potomac since the late 1700s, and they just stopped now because of a court ruling. And they're between Montgomery and Loudoun counties. Right around Thanksgiving, the Loudoun, Virginia County Circuit Court issued a decision between the ferry operator and a private landowner in Virginia that declared there was no legally established public or private landing area on the Rockland Farms property where the ferry had been operating all these years. The two sides could not negotiate an agreement that would allow the ferry to keep going. So the privately owned ferry has ceased operations, according to the news release. Loudoun County was not involved in the legal dispute, although the county remains concerned about the outcome from a regional transportation perspective, it states in the news release. And that's the thing. There's only one way across around this area. If you can't cross there, now you got to go someplace else. And what's weird is I remember not so long ago in Macomb County, Michigan, I believe it was I-94, stretch of I-94. And there's a bridge over I-94 that allowed people to get very quickly from an exit to their town. And that bridge over was being maintained one year, and they shut it down completely. And I remember them showing the alternate routes that these people had to take to get home when they couldn't just do the little simple thing. It was all convoluted, almost like a Rube Goldberg device to get home. And so it's interesting how this stuff evolves. Montgomery County Executive Mark Elrich also expressed his concern in a tweet. He said the end of White's Ferry is a deeply concerning issue. He noted that he directed Montgomery County Department of Transportation, the county attorney, and the Loudoun County government to determine how best to address the closure. In its news release, White's Ferry noted that it regrets to inform the public that it will cease operation over the Potomac River. The Circuit Court of Loudoun County, Virginia, has ruled that no public landing exists on the Virginia shoreline at White's Ferry Road, and the ferry is prohibited from landing at that location in Virginia. That's from the news release. As of the date of this press release, Loudoun County, Virginia has declined to establish a public landing at that location. Historic White's Ferry is the last of about 100 ferries that used to operate on the Potomac River. Recently, it cost $5 per car and $2 per pedestrian to get across on the ferry. The ferry followed a wire cable to cross the Potomac. So The Hill also covered it, and again, talks about how widely reported this is. DC-ist also reported it, and the conflict comes from the location of the landing site on Rockland Farm, which was given to the ferry in 1871, but the problem is the location was never appropriately marked on a map, okay? And so the lack of that's what's causing all the confusion. The court ruled that no public landing exists on the Virginia shoreline at White's Ferry Road, and the ferry is prohibited from landing at that location in Virginia. Now, the man who is currently running this, his father is the one who'd relaunched the ferry service in 1946 after they'd been stopped for about a decade. His family made the decision to end the ferry service because of court order. We knew there was an injunction coming that we couldn't land in Virginia, so we made the decision it would make no sense in opening up for just the one last week. The biggest question here, apparently, according to the judge, is that it was uncertain whether the landing was actually on public land. Evidence of the ferry landing has been in the same place for a long period of time, even back to 1871, may have persuasive value on the broader issue of location, but does not provide reasonable certainty regarding the more specific issue of that location. One of the owners of the farm that's at the center of this told DCS that her family had no intention of shutting down the service and had merely attempted to reach an agreement beforehand. The owners decided they would just walk away from the business. We did not shut down the ferry. We tried everything to keep it running. The man who's running the ferry said that the deals that were offered were too expensive for the ferry to keep operating. He did not say whether he thought the ferry service would ever run again. DCS noticed that many local politicians weighed in on the ferry's closing. One politician wrote, "This needs to be fixed immediately. White's Ferry keeps so many vehicles off of 15, 495, and 270 each day. It's an important part of our transportation infrastructure." Town commissioners from a nearby village said, "The Poolesville commissioners are actively working with Montgomery County and state of Maryland officials in an attempt to keep the ferry operational." So what's weird about this is this business has been operating for a couple hundred years, and apparently they've been doing it at the same place. And one side of this ferry is apparently embarking and disembarking on land adjacent to or part of a piece of private property. And the people who've run and own that land right now have said, well, we think that's on our property. I know people are going to say, but Steve, what about adverse possession? Well, these articles, and I actually read 3 different articles on it, don't address that issue. I don't know what the real issue here is, because you would think that 230 years of use would get you something. But it also might be that because they've apparently shut down and reopened a couple times, at least once, but we don't know that they've always been at the exact same spot. That's one of the issues. And what's weird is I've read cases about adverse possession or property disputes, and you'd be surprised at what kinds of evidence they'll have to look at to determine whether or not something's been used for 200 years. They start bringing in things like the old folks who are still around who go, oh yeah, I remember my grandfather used to tell me such and such. And generally speaking, stuff that was told to you by your grandfather 50 years ago, and he's been dead for 45, is not terribly reliable or acceptable in most courts. But if that's all you got to go on, sometimes that might be what you do. And we've also talked about rivers and whether or not a river is navigable. And navigability of rivers is often defined by whether or not you can float a log down it, or if they ever could. And some people have actually brought in the old folks who did the logging a long time ago. They might not be logging in the area anymore. But back when they did they float logs down that river? Yes, they did. How do you know? I remember them doing it back in the summer of '03 or whatever. So it's a crazy story. But the weird part is that there are ferries like this still around. On Lake Charlevoix in Michigan, there's at the south end a little town called Ironton. And Ironton is on one side of one of the arms of the lake, they call it. And so if you want to get around to the other side of the lake, you can drive around, but it's a long, long haul through East Jordan and so on. Beautiful drive. But if you want to cut it short, there's a ferry. And you just line up on one side and the ferry comes over and pull your car on and they take you across and you get off and a couple bucks, $5, something like that. And it saves so much time that even when you stop and wait for the ferry to come back, it still saves time to get on the ferry and go across. And that's one of those ferries that's actually got a cable that, drags it back and forth, drags itself back and forth using the cable. And there's actually a really cool restaurant called The Landing on one side. And I was up there with some friends 2 summers ago. And it was interesting because I remember sitting there eating lunch, watching the ferry go back and forth. And, it's like a... It's like a throwback to an earlier time, except they're cars instead of horses and buggies. So there you go. But it's a crazy story that this business has been there more or less for 230 years. And they're going to stop now because they've been told that one side of their business was landing on property they had no right to be on after 230 years. So White's Ferry ends a 230-year plus run over land dispute. Suzanne Pollock wrote that one. The Hill was written by Joseph Choi. And Raffi sent it to me. Thanks a lot. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. It's a sort of glass half full, glass stops existing in time and space kind of deal.